I never thought the word betrayal could feel so heavy until the night I found lipstick on my husband's shirt, and it wasn't mine. The flash of red burned into my mind, a screaming reminder that everything I believed about loyalty and love might have been nothing more than a lie. My heart hammered so hard I thought it might break through my chest, and yet, at that moment, I stayed silent, gripping that shirt like it was a weapon. If you want more stories like this, subscribe, give this a like, and share where you're tuning in from in the comments. My name is Melissa Carter. I was 34 years old back then, and I worked as a senior event planner in Atlanta. The year was 2019, and life had been moving at full speed, a booming career, a picture-perfect marriage, and a home I thought was filled with trust. But sometimes, perfection hides the darkest cracks, and mine began with something as small as a smudge of lipstick. I told myself maybe it wasn't what it looked like. Maybe I was overthinking. Maybe the lipstick had somehow brushed off during a work event. Maybe I was just tired and imagining things. But deep down, a voice I didn't want to listen to whispered otherwise. That same night, while he showered, I sat on the edge of our bed, staring at that shirt as if it were whispering the truth I wasn't ready to face. I had been married to David for 6 years, and in those 6 years, I had given him everything: my loyalty, my support, my energy. I had stood beside him when he was laid off, when his father passed away, when the bills piled up higher than we could handle. Through it all, I never questioned us. I believed we were unshakable. But that lipstick was the first crack in my blind faith. When David stepped out of the bathroom, towel wrapped around his waist, he caught me holding his shirt. His face froze for a second, not long, but enough to tell me he knew exactly what I was staring at. "What's that?" I asked, my voice lower than usual, careful. He shrugged too casually. "I don't know. Probably brushed against something. You know how crowded those networking mixers get." Networking mixers. The kind where he always claimed to be building connections, while I sat at home, too exhausted after planning galas and fundraisers to join him. I nodded, letting him believe I bought his story. But inside, something shifted. Curiosity took root where trust used to live. And once curiosity begins, it never stops quietly. That night, while David slept soundly beside me, I stared at the ceiling, wondering what else I had missed. Wondering if the marriage I thought was unshakable was already broken. The days that followed felt like living in a fog. I went to work, scheduled corporate luncheons, coordinated charity galas, smiled at clients, but underneath it all, my mind kept circling back to that lipstick stain. It was like a splinter buried under the skin. Too small to justify cutting open, but impossible to ignore. Every detail of David's behavior suddenly seemed magnified. The way he guarded his phone more tightly than usual, the way his texts came late at night, the way he suddenly had to stay longer at the office, but returned smelling faintly of perfume. At first, I told myself it was paranoia, that maybe I was unraveling over nothing. But each day the tension inside me grew like a storm pressing against its own sky. One Friday evening, he said he was heading to another networking dinner. I kissed him goodbye at the door, watched him leave in his navy suit, then locked the door behind him. But instead of sitting down to unwind with a glass of wine like I usually did, I grabbed my keys. My chest pounded as I slid into my car. I didn't even fully plan it, my body just moved, as if some part of me had already decided I needed answers. I followed at a distance, headlights dimmed, hands gripping the steering wheel so hard they ached. He drove downtown, weaving past the glow of streetlights, and pulled up outside a boutique hotel, not the office, not a restaurant, not even close. My breath hitched as I watched him step out, straighten his tie, and glance around nervously before disappearing inside. My pulse thundered in my ears. Tension tightened every muscle in my body, making it hard to even breathe. For a split second, I thought about storming in after him, catching him red-handed in whatever he was doing. But another part of me whispered, not yet. Watch. Collect. Confirm. So I sat there, in the shadows of my car, waiting. Minutes dragged like hours. Each one stretched with the sickening thought of what he was doing upstairs, who he was with, and what lies he would spin when he came home later. The tension inside me was unbearable, like the whole world had narrowed down to the single doorway of that hotel. When he finally came out an hour later, he wasn't alone. A tall brunette in a red dress clung to his arm, laughing softly as he hailed a cab. The sight hit me like a gut punch, and I dug my nails into the steering wheel so deep I thought I'd tear the leather. It wasn't just suspicion anymore. It was fact. The brunette leaned into him as if they'd known each other for years, her hand sliding across his chest in a way that made my stomach twist. I sat frozen in the car, headlights still dim, praying they wouldn't notice me. The city lights danced across his face as he opened the cab door for her, and I saw something I hadn't seen in months, a spark in his eyes, the kind of excitement he hadn't shown me in a long time. When the cab pulled away, I followed at a safe distance. My knuckles were pale from gripping the steering wheel, every nerve on edge. They didn't go to a restaurant. They didn't go to a bar. The cab wound its way into a quiet neighborhood I didn't recognize. They stopped at a townhouse, the kind with flower boxes in the windows and warm lights glowing inside. My heart sank as I watched them step through the front door, hand in hand, as if they belonged there together. I parked half a block down and sat there in silence, the truth pressing down on me like a weight. There was no room left for doubt. The lipstick, the late nights, the networking events. He was cheating. And worse, he had a whole second life I hadn't known about. The suspicion that had been gnawing at me now hardened into something sharper. Rage, yes, but also a cold, calculating focus. I wasn't the type to explode or scream. I wasn't going to cause a scene in the middle of the street. Instead, I found myself memorizing the address, whispering it under my breath like an oath. On the drive home, my thoughts were a storm. How long had this been going on? Who was she? Did his coworkers know? Did his family? Did I look like a fool every time I told friends he was working late? By the time I pulled into our driveway, my suspicion had grown roots, spreading into every corner of my mind. I knew I couldn't confront him yet. He'd deny it, gaslight me, twist the story until I questioned my own eyes. No, I needed proof. Solid, undeniable proof that even he couldn't talk his way out of. That night, lying beside him in bed while he snored softly, I stared at the ceiling with my mind racing. My suspicion had grown into certainty, but certainty wasn't enough. What I wanted now was evidence. And after evidence, I wanted revenge. The next morning, the sunlight streaming through the blinds felt almost insulting. David was humming as he brewed coffee, scrolling through his phone like he didn't have a care in the world. Watching him in that moment filled me with a frustration so sharp it made my throat ache. He slid a mug across the counter toward me with that same easy smile he'd always worn. "Busy day?" he asked casually, as though the night before hadn't happened, as though I hadn't followed him to another woman's home and watched him betray every vow he'd ever made to me. "Yeah," I said flatly, wrapping my hands around the warm ceramic just to stop them from shaking. "Back-to-back meetings." He nodded, completely oblivious. That was the thing, he wasn't just lying to me, he was comfortable lying. It rolled off him as easily as breathing. And that frustrated me more than anything. How many times had he kissed me goodnight after leaving her place? How many times had he sworn he was working late while she waited for him in that townhouse? I sat across from him at the table, chewing mechanically on a piece of toast I didn't taste, and forced myself to study him like I was seeing him for the first time. The way he checked his phone every few minutes, smiling faintly at something on the screen. The way his tone had a careless edge, as if his mind was elsewhere. My frustration built with every passing second. I wanted to scream at him. I wanted to throw that mug of coffee against the wall and watch it shatter. But instead, I swallowed my anger like poison, reminding myself that I couldn't afford to lose control. Not yet. At work later that day, it was almost impossible to focus. Every time a client talked about flowers or centerpieces, my mind drifted back to that townhouse. I imagined her decorating it, cooking for him, laughing at his dumb jokes. I imagined him holding her the way he used to hold me. By lunchtime, the frustration inside me had reached a boiling point. I ducked into an empty conference room, shut the door, and let out a sharp, ragged breath. I knew I couldn't keep going like this, pretending I didn't know. But I also knew frustration alone wasn't enough. I needed to take action. That evening, David texted me that he would be working late again. The words flashed across my phone screen like a dare. My fingers trembled as I read them, frustration burning so hot it almost blinded me. He wasn't even trying to be clever anymore. He assumed I would just accept it, like I always had. But this time, I didn't. I drove straight to the townhouse I'd memorized. My frustration had hardened into a restless determination. I needed to see it again, needed to confirm it with my own eyes. I parked in the same spot as before, far enough not to draw attention, and waited. The street was quiet, lined with trees that swayed gently in the warm night air. When his car finally appeared, my chest tightened. I watched him step out, loosen his tie, and head toward the door with a confidence that made my blood boil. Seconds later, the brunette opened it. She greeted him with a kiss that left no room for doubt. Frustration clenched around me like a vice. I gripped the steering wheel, nails biting into the leather. How many times had I defended him to my friends, telling them he was just stressed? How many times had I covered for him with his family when he disappeared at holidays? The townhouse windows glowed as shadows moved behind the curtains. My heart pounded with the weight of frustration and helplessness, but beneath it, something unexpected stirred, a flicker of resolve. I realized then that frustration could only eat me alive if I let it. But if I used it, if I turned it into fuel, it could become something else. Something sharper. I pulled out my phone and snapped a picture of his car parked out front, license plate clear. Then another of the two of them standing in the doorway, arms wrapped around each other. My hands were shaking, but I steadied them. Each click of the camera was like reclaiming a piece of myself he thought he'd stolen. As I sat there in the dark, frustration slowly gave way to a small, dangerous hope. Proof was building, and I knew exactly what to do with it. The next morning, I woke up with a different kind of energy pulsing through me. The frustration from the night before had burned itself into something sharper, conflict. A war between the life I had built with David and the truth I couldn't unsee. I looked at him across the breakfast table, his smile easy, his words light, like he wasn't living a double life. It made my stomach twist. But instead of lashing out, I kept my tone even. I was thinking we should plan a weekend trip soon, I said, stirring my coffee slowly. Just the two of us. We haven't done that in a while. He didn't even look up from his phone. Maybe. Work's crazy right now. Work. Always work. My jaw tightened, but I smiled anyway, as if nothing was wrong. Inside, though, the conflict raged louder. One side of me screamed to confront him, to throw the photos on the table and demand the truth. The other side whispered that patience was my best weapon. That day at the office, I sat in on meetings, but barely heard a word. The conflict inside me was too loud. How do you live with someone who lies to your face? How do you pretend to share a life when every word, every gesture, feels like a performance? I knew I couldn't stay suspended in this limbo forever. Something had to give. Either I confronted him and risked the fallout, or I played the long game, collected more, and made sure he didn't just lose me, he lost everything he'd built on his lies. When I got home that night, his car wasn't in the driveway. My chest tightened, and I felt the conflict inside me rising again, threatening to spill over. He walked in nearly an hour later, claiming he'd been at the gym. His hair was damp, his shirt smelled faintly of her perfume, and I wanted to scream. Instead, I said nothing. I just watched him move around the kitchen, humming to himself, and the silence between us stretched like glass, fragile, dangerous, ready to shatter at the slightest touch. That night, as David slept beside me, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The conflict inside me was unbearable. Every time he shifted in bed, I flinched. Every time he breathed deeply, I felt rage coil tighter in my chest. My heart wanted to explode, to shake him awake and scream, "How dare you?" But my mind whispered, "Not yet. Be smarter than that." The truth was, a direct confrontation wouldn't just end in shouting. He'd deny everything, twist the story, make me out to be the jealous, paranoid wife. That was his strength, lying with ease, turning blame until it wrapped around my shoulders like a noose. I turned on my side and studied his face in the moonlight. To anyone else, he looked peaceful. To me, he looked like a stranger. And in that moment, something hardened inside me. The conflict wasn't just between me and him anymore, it was inside me. Did I want to salvage this marriage, or did I want to watch it burn? The next day, I reached out to a private investigator. It felt surreal, dialing the number, my hands trembling as I explained what I needed. The man on the other end spoke calmly, like this was routine for him, which in a way, it was. For me, though, it was war. "I'll need details," he said. "Schedule, license plate, places he frequents." I provided it all. Every scrap of information I'd collected, the townhouse address, his work schedule, even the photos I'd taken. Each word I spoke out loud made the conflict sharper. Because what I was really doing was choosing a side. When I hung up, I sat in my car in the office parking lot, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. I had crossed a line. I wasn't just suspicious anymore. I wasn't just frustrated. I was building a case. That night, when David wrapped his arms around me in bed, I lay stiff and unresponsive. He whispered good night like nothing had changed, but inside me, everything had. The conflict was over. I had chosen. I wasn't going to save this marriage. I was going to end it. Once I made that choice, something in me shifted. The heaviness of conflict gave way to a fierce determination. If David wanted to play games, I would outplay him. If he thought I'd cry quietly while he lived a double life, he was about to learn how wrong he was. The private investigator moved quickly. Within a week, he delivered photos that made my stomach turn. David and the brunette at restaurants, holding hands in public, slipping into that townhouse together, her head on his shoulder in the car. The images were crystal clear, undeniable. I studied them late at night, the glow of my laptop burning into my eyes, my chest pounding with equal parts pain and resolve. It hurt, God, it hurt, but it also gave me focus. This wasn't just about heartbreak anymore. This was about justice. I started digging into his finances next. While he slept, I combed through our shared bank account. Charges I had ignored before now screamed at me. Dinners at upscale restaurants, charges at boutique stores I never shopped in, hotel stays that didn't match his business trips. Each discovery fanned the flames of my determination. He wasn't just betraying me emotionally, he was draining our money to fund his affair. That was when I knew I wasn't just going to leave him. I was going to make sure when I walked away, I took the ground out from under him. At work, no one suspected a thing. I smiled, I planned charity galas, I charmed clients. But inside, I was drafting the blueprint of his downfall. Every detail I uncovered became a weapon. Every lie he told became ammunition. And I didn't feel guilty. Not one bit. If he had chosen honesty, maybe we could have fixed it. But he had chosen betrayal, and that meant I was free to choose revenge. The more I uncovered, the more determined I became. David's networking dinners weren't just lies, they were fully funded by our joint account. Dinners at steakhouses that cost more than my weekly groceries. Jewelry stores where he bought her gifts I never received. Even a weekend getaway to Charleston, charged under the vague title of business conference. Each discovery made my hands tremble, not with weakness, but with strength. I was arming myself. Piece by piece, I was building a case so ironclad that when I finally struck, there would be no escape for him. I started keeping a private folder, hidden deep in my work laptop, where I stored everything: bank statements, credit card records, photos from the investigator, screenshots of his text notifications when he carelessly left his phone face up. I gave it a name that sounded innocuous, vendor lists, so even if he stumbled across it, he'd never open it. At night, I lay beside him, feeling the heat of his body while mine pulsed with determination. He thought he was clever, but he had no idea the woman lying inches away from him was already plotting his collapse. The plan grew clearer every day. I wouldn't just leave. I would time it perfectly. I would make sure every secret he'd tried to bury was unearthed in one catastrophic wave. But more than that, I wanted him to feel what I felt: blindsided, betrayed, powerless. I wanted him to look at me one day with that same sinking feeling I had when I first saw lipstick on his shirt. As I stared at the folder on my laptop one night, fingers tracing the touchpad like I was petting a loaded weapon, one thought ran through my mind on repeat. He thought he was playing me, but I was about to show him the real game. From that moment on, everything escalated. The lies became more frequent, the excuses sloppier, the gaps in his stories wider. But instead of feeling crushed the way I once had, I began to feel something else: power. Every time David fed me another flimsy excuse, I nodded sweetly, playing the role of the trusting wife. And every time, I made a quiet note of it. The time, the place, the detail. I was building a timeline, one that painted the picture of a man unraveling in his own deceit. One night, he came home late again, smelling of perfume I didn't wear. He tossed his jacket over the chair, kissed me lightly on the forehead, and muttered something about long hours at the office. I smiled up at him. You must be exhausted. If he noticed the calm in my voice, he didn't show it. He showered, ate leftovers in silence, and fell asleep within minutes. I lay beside him, staring into the dark. Because now, it wasn't just about catching him. It was about setting the stage. Every lie he told made my case stronger. Every careless mistake he made pushed him closer to the edge. But with each escalation, the desperation in me grew too. I wasn't content to just leave him. I wanted him to feel the full weight of what he had done. I wanted him to lose more than just me. I wanted him to lose his reputation, his security, his comfort. I wanted him to know that betrayal had consequences. The next day, I met the private investigator again. He handed me a new set of photos, this time of David and the brunette walking into a jewelry store together, his hand at the small of her back, his smile wide and easy. My throat tightened, but I forced myself to hold steady. Do you want me to keep going? The investigator asked, studying my face. I hesitated for a moment, then nodded. Yes, keep going. I want everything. Because escalation wasn't just his pattern anymore. It was mine too. The investigator didn't disappoint. Within 2 weeks, I had an entire portfolio of David's double life. Photos of him and the brunette kissing in parking lots. Receipts from expensive restaurants. Records of hotel bookings under his name. It was everything I needed and more than I ever wanted to know. One picture in particular nearly broke me. David kneeling slightly to fasten a delicate bracelet around her wrist, his face lit with tenderness. The same tenderness he used to show me. My chest tightened until I could barely breathe. But instead of falling apart, I felt my desperation sharpen into something lethal. I wasn't just desperate for answers anymore. I was desperate to make sure he paid for every single moment he had stolen from me. At home, I played my role flawlessly. I laughed at his jokes. I made dinner. I asked about his day. Each smile I gave him was a mask, covering the storm that raged underneath. If he noticed the cracks in my voice or the coolness in my touch, he didn't comment. He was too wrapped up in himself, in her, to realize the walls around him were closing in. Late one night, after he'd fallen asleep, I sat in the kitchen with all the evidence spread out across the table. Photos, receipts, statements. My hands trembled as I organized them into neat piles, but not from fear. From anticipation. I knew exactly what I was going to do. I wasn't just going to confront him. That would be too easy. Too quick. No, I was going to let him think he had won, let him keep building his fantasy life, until the very moment I pulled the rug out from under him. I imagined his face when it all came crashing down. The shock, the denial, the panic. The desperation that would mirror my own. And in that vision, for the first time since this nightmare began, I felt something almost intoxicating. Hope. Hope was a dangerous thing, but it lit a fire in me. For weeks, I had lived in shadows, collecting secrets, carrying the weight of betrayal in silence. But now, with evidence neatly tucked away, hope grew into empowerment. I wasn't just a wife who'd been cheated on, I was the architect of his downfall. I started making quiet moves. I opened a separate bank account under my name, transferring small amounts of money into it so he wouldn't notice. I updated my passwords, secured my documents, and even consulted with a divorce attorney under the guise of a lunch meeting. Every step I took gave me a sense of control I hadn't felt in months. The attorney was blunt, her words sharp and grounding. With the evidence you've collected, he doesn't stand a chance of walking away clean. If you want the house, if you want spousal support, if you want to drain him legally, you can. I nodded, the weight of empowerment settling into my bones. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about reclaiming everything he thought I wouldn't fight for. At home, I continued to play my part. I let him believe his lies were working, let him think I was still the clueless, supportive wife. Inside, though, I was smiling at every secret victory. The bank account in my name, the copies of his financial records, the attorney's number saved under a fake contact labeled florist. One night, as he bragged about a promotion he claimed was just around the corner, I caught myself laughing genuinely, not at his story, but at the irony. He thought his life was about to get easier. He had no idea it was about to implode. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was standing taller. I wasn't waiting for him to hand me scraps of truth anymore. I was holding the truth in my hands, and with it, his future. Empowerment wasn't just a feeling. It was a weapon. With every passing day, my empowerment grew bolder. I began to test the edges of my plan, quietly pushing boundaries just to see how much control I really had. I started by shadowing his schedule. If he said he had a late meeting, I already knew where he would be thanks to the investigator's reports. I knew her townhouse schedule better than he did. And sometimes, I'd drive by on my way home, just to see his car parked outside, a quiet reminder that I was 5 steps ahead of him. I also began to weave subtle lies of my own. I'm staying late at work, I'd say casually, even though I'd already left the office. Sometimes I'd tell him I had dinner with a client, when in reality I was sitting in my car outside the attorney's office, finalizing paperwork he didn't know existed. Watching him swallow my lies without hesitation was deliciously ironic. The power dynamic had shifted, and I could feel it in my bones. He thought he was in control, sneaking around, juggling 2 lives. But in truth, I was the one writing the script, every move calculated, every detail accounted for. One evening, as we sat on the couch watching TV, his phone buzzed. He excused himself, stepping into the other room to answer it, lowering his voice. Normally, I would have strained to listen. But this time, I didn't need to. I already knew who it was. I already knew what was being whispered on the other end. And instead of anger, I felt something I hadn't expected, a thrill. Not because he was cheating, but because I was in complete control of what came next. When he returned, flashing me that same tired smile, I almost laughed. He thought he was fooling me. He thought he was winning. But I knew better. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt empowered enough to whisper the truth silently to myself, savoring it like a secret weapon. I'm the one playing you now, David. The turning point came faster than I expected. It was a Thursday evening, a week before his birthday. David had been unusually cheerful, humming while he showered, even asking me if I had plans for the weekend. I knew what that meant. He was planning to spend his birthday with her instead of me. The audacity made my blood boil, but at the same time, it was the crack in the foundation I had been waiting for. That night, as he left for another late meeting, I stood by the window and watched his taillights disappear into the dark. Something inside me clicked. This wasn't just about gathering evidence anymore. This was the moment I'd been building toward, the turning point where I stopped being reactive and started being deliberate. I opened my laptop and pulled up the folder labeled Vendor Lists. Rows of photos stared back at me, David's arm around her waist, his lips pressed to hers, their cozy weekends away, his credit card slips for dinners and jewelry. Every image, every receipt, every document was a brick in the wall I was constructing around him. But I wasn't satisfied with just keeping it to myself anymore. No, I wanted others to see it too. I wanted the world he had built on lies to collapse publicly, the way mine had privately. So I started drafting an email, one addressed to his boss, his coworkers, his closest friends. I attached a few of the most damning photos, the ones impossible to explain away. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, trembling, but not from fear. From adrenaline. The turning point wasn't just that I had the power. It was that I was finally ready to use it. But I didn't hit send. Not yet. I wanted the timing to be perfect. I wanted to wait until the risk was worth the reward. So instead, I saved the draft, closed the laptop, and poured myself a glass of wine. For the first time in months, I felt calm, steady, in control. Because the next move wasn't his anymore. It was mine. I carried that calmness with me for the next few days, and it rattled David. He didn't know what had changed, but he could sense it. The way I carried myself, the way I smiled just a little too knowingly, the way I stopped asking questions about his late nights, it all unsettled him. "What's with you lately?" he asked one morning, frowning as he buttoned his shirt. "Nothing," I replied lightly, sipping my coffee. "Just focused." Focused. He had no idea how true that word was. By then, the risk I was taking didn't scare me anymore, it thrilled me. I was playing with fire, but I held the match. Every interaction with him became a test of restraint, a game of pretending to be oblivious, while I carried his entire downfall in my back pocket. The private investigator had just delivered the final piece I needed, proof that the townhouse he spent so much time in wasn't just hers. He was paying part of the rent. With our money. My jaw clenched when I saw the receipts, but instead of despair, I felt fire. Because now, the risk wasn't mine anymore. It was his. He had built his secret life on my resources, my trust, my name. And I was the only one who could destroy it. That night, I sat on the couch with him while he scrolled on his phone, smirking at messages I knew weren't from work. I leaned over, kissed his cheek, and whispered, "I hope you know I'll always take care of us." He glanced at me, confused for a second, but then smiled and nodded, clearly eager to get back to his phone. I hid my smirk behind a sip of wine. The risk wasn't whether or not he'd get caught anymore. The risk was when I would decide to end the game. The showdown came on his birthday. He had told me a week earlier that he needed to work late that night, but I played along, pretending not to notice the lie dripping from his words. I baked a cake that morning anyway, frosted it, and left it on the counter like a symbol of the life he had chosen to throw away. Then, with my folder of evidence neatly organized in a slim black binder, I dressed in my sharpest suit and drove downtown, not to his office, not to our home, but to the restaurant where I knew he'd be celebrating. The investigator had given me the reservation details, a private table for two at a dimly lit French restaurant. When I walked in, I spotted them instantly. The brunette was wearing a red dress, leaning across the table, laughing at something he'd said. David looked younger than he had in years, his eyes shining, his hand grazing hers on the tablecloth. I didn't hesitate. My heels clicked against the marble floor as I approached, binder in hand, heart steady. When I stopped at their table, David's face drained of color. "Melissa," he stammered, nearly choking on his wine. The brunette turned, brows furrowed, clearly not expecting me. I smiled sweetly, sliding the binder onto the table. "Happy birthday, David. I thought I'd bring you a present." He didn't reach for it, but she did. She opened the binder, her eyes darting across the photos, the receipts, the hotel bills. Her face paled as realization sank in. "David," she whispered, her voice sharp, "what is this?" His mouth opened and closed, words failing him for the first time since I'd known him. And in that silence, that perfect, suffocating silence, I felt something shift. For months, he had been in control. But here, in front of her, in front of his lies laid bare, the power belonged entirely to me. The showdown had begun. David's hand shot out, trying to close the binder, but the brunette yanked it closer, flipping through the pages with trembling fingers. Photo after photo, receipt after receipt, the entire story of his betrayal laid bare in black and white. Her face twisted with disgust. "You told me she stopped, glaring at him. You said your marriage was basically over." I leaned against the table, calm, steady. "Oh, he said the same thing to me about you. That you were just some work connection, nothing serious." Her jaw dropped, and for a split second, I thought she might throw her wine in his face. David sputtered, reaching for words he couldn't find. "Melissa, let's not do this here." I smiled coldly. "Why not? You've been doing it everywhere else." Other diners were beginning to notice, heads turning, whispers spreading across the restaurant. The brunette shoved the binder back at him with a look of utter contempt. "You're disgusting," she spat before grabbing her purse and storming out, her heels clattering against the tile. The moment the door shut behind her, David turned to me, his face red, his voice low and desperate. "What do you want, Melissa? Money? To make a scene?" I tilted my head, savoring the panic in his eyes. "I don't want your money, David. I want you to feel exactly what I felt. Exposed. Humiliated. Powerless." He glanced around the room, realizing every pair of eyes was on him. His perfect image, the hardworking, charming man, was crumbling in real time. I leaned closer, lowering my voice so only he could hear. "And this is just the beginning. I've already spoken to my lawyer. By the time I'm done, you won't just lose me. You'll lose everything you've built on my name, my support, and my trust." His hand trembled against the stem of his wine glass. For once, David had no clever excuse, no polished lie. Only silence. And in that silence, I finally felt the weight of his betrayal lift from my chest. The showdown was mine. The next few weeks unfolded like watching a storm finally break after months of suffocating heat. Reflection came in waves, sometimes hitting me when I least expected it. I'd sit in my car before work, staring at the steering wheel, remembering the woman I had been just months before, the trusting wife who thought a lipstick stain was probably nothing. How naive she had been. How willing she was to explain away the unexplainable, to protect a man who was building a secret life behind her back. Now I was someone else entirely. Stronger, sharper, unafraid of the truth. The divorce process began almost immediately. My attorney, armed with the evidence I had so carefully gathered, didn't just make demands, she delivered ultimatums. The house, a portion of his retirement, spousal support. He resisted at first, of course, bluffing with the arrogance I once found charming. But when the binder appeared on the negotiation table, his lawyer leaned in and whispered something that drained the last fight from his face. He signed. Outside the courthouse, I stood beneath the wide Georgia sky, a stack of finalized papers in my hand. Freedom, inked into permanence. Reflection turned bittersweet as I thought of everything I had lost, time, trust, love I had poured into someone who didn't deserve a drop of it. But mingled with that grief was something brighter, the knowledge that I had survived, that I had fought back, that I had refused to let his betrayal define me. Sometimes, late at night, I still caught myself wondering if there had been signs from the very beginning. Little cracks I ignored because I wanted so badly to believe in us. Maybe there were. Maybe I had been blind. But standing there, free of him, I realized it didn't matter anymore. What mattered was that I wasn't blind anymore. I saw myself clearly, and for the first time in years, I liked the woman staring back at me. In the months that followed, closure became less about David and more about me. For years, I had built my life around him, his career, his dreams, his lies. Now, every decision I made belonged solely to me. I redecorated the house, stripping it of every trace of him. The suit jackets in the closet, the cologne on the dresser, the framed photos that once hung in the hallway, all of it gone. In their place, I hung pieces that reflected me, bright art, travel photos, small reminders that my life was mine again. At first, the silence felt strange. The absence of his footsteps, his voice, his constant excuses. But slowly, that silence became a kind of music. Peaceful. Healing. One evening, I sat on the back porch with a glass of wine, watching the sun sink below the horizon. I thought back to the night I found that lipstick stain, the way my chest had clenched, the way fear and suspicion had taken root inside me. That moment had felt like the end of everything. But now I realized it had been the beginning. The beginning of me finding my strength, my voice, my freedom. Don't forget to subscribe and drop a comment telling me your city. It's always fun to see where our stories travel. Revenge had been sweet, yes. Watching him crumble, watching his lies collapse, had been a satisfaction I would never forget. But the real reward wasn't in his downfall. It was in my rise. I smiled to myself, raising the glass in a quiet toast. Not to David, Not to what we'd lost, but to myself, to the woman who had walked through betrayal and come out stronger on the other side. And if there was one thing I knew for certain, it was this. Cheating hurts, but revenge? Revenge had been the spark that lit the fire of my rebirth. Don't forget to subscribe and drop a comment telling me your city. It's always fun to see where our stories travel.